Good evening, everyone. Tonight, we are delighted to welcome Mr. Douthat to Politics on the Edge.
Flawless.
Mr. Douthat appears to specialize in hopeless causes. As the conservative voice among New York Times columnists, Mr. Douthat tries to persuade his mostly liberal audience that some of their opinions need rethinking. As if that wasn't enough for him, he also moonlights as the movie reviewer at the National Review, trying to persuade the audience there that a dying medium is worth our attention. Of course, as a great admirer of his writings, I think he is more than up to the challenge. His columns display a unique empathy for the other side and a sharpened understanding of what they believe. Educated at Harvard, many of Douthat's highly consumable columns and books are grounded in deep thinkers like Jacques Maritain and Jacques Barzun. Yet he rarely falls into scholarly orthodoxy, perhaps due to his outsider's perspective on things to do with things like his conversion to Catholicism and his battles with medicine's attitude towards Lyme disease. These experiences are masterfully documented in his book To Change the Church, Pope Francis and the Future of Catholicism, and his most recent book, The Deep Places, a memoir of illness and discovery. I am extremely excited then to see what Mr. Douthat has to say in his talk, from Reaganism to Trumpism, how conservatives decided it was evening in America. So I'd like to express my gratitude to Mr. Douthat for generously coming to speak to us tonight. And I'd also like to thank the Andrea Mitchell Center and the SNF Paideia program's Red and Blue Exchange, along with the Philomathean Society for facilitating this event. Without further ado, please welcome Mr. Douthat.
Thank you all so much for being here. It's really a pleasure to be here with you. I'm grateful to all of the impressive institutions above, but especially to the Philomathean Society, which recently inducted me into their mysteries, forced me to wear a stag's head and perform various heroic couplets and reenact several of Euripides' tragedies and so on. So it's been an exciting couple of hours. If I seem a little winded from running naked around the entirety of UPenn's campus, you can blame the society and its personnel. But what we are going to talk about tonight is not the Bacchic mysteries, but something even more mysterious, which is the evolution of the Republican Party over the last 40-odd years, from the era of Ronald Reagan to the era of Donald Trump. And I'll probably try not to keep this too long, try and go 30 or 35 minutes or so. And then are we going to 8:30 or so? I can take questions for as long as you guys would like to have a conversation, but I assume that this room will be claimed by some other important campus society at some point in the evening. But so the theme that I chose is the idea that, as the title suggests, that conservatism in the United States has gone from being defined by sunny optimism, a belief in the brighter tomorrow, a sort of confidence in the American dream and the American mission in the world, all of which are seen in hindsight as sort of core elements of Ronald Reagan's optimistic message, to a somewhat darker vision of the United States, summed up maybe by the famous phrase in Donald Trump's, well, we'll call it the first inaugural address, because who knows what lies in our future, where he described American carnage as sort of the defining feature of American life, I guess, then in 2016. And in telling this story, I want to start out with one substantial caveat, right, which is that any kind of, arc of history, transformation story like this one emphasizes discontinuities, when in fact there are obviously also continuities in conservative politics in America. So if you go back and sort of hunt through the history of Ronald Reagan's political career, his political message, his policy positions, and so on, and look for things that remind you of Donald Trump, you will in fact find such things. The American right in the 1970s was not at all always characterized by optimism about America. A lot of conservative activism in the 1960s and 70s was in fact characterized by fear and anxiety and concern over American decline. fear of social revolution, fear of social liberalism, all forces that you see at work on the American right today. So there is that kind of continuity. There's continuity in policy. Some people will say, oh, you know, Donald Trump moved the Republican Party in a more protectionist direction on trade and economics. And obviously he did, but by the same token, you can go back and find Ronald Reagan, like George W. Bush after him, imposing tariffs and, you know, sort of performing protectionist acts. There's no sort of perfectly clean division between the conservatism of the past and the conservatism of the present. And in fact, one of Ronald Reagan's slogans when he ran for president was a version of Trump's "Make America Great Again," just delivered with a slightly sunnier attitude as he said it. So that's the big caveat, which we can certainly dig into more in the discussion in the Q&A. To what extent is there always certain continuities in American politics that don't disappear just because there also seem to be ruptures? But with that being said, I do think that there was and has been a real rupture in American right-wing politics over the last couple of generations, and a real change in the default perspective that a lot of American conservatives and American Republican voters have about the situation in the United States, the future destiny of the United States, America's role in the world, what's likely to happen over the next 20 or 30 years, and what the mission, especially of conservatism, should be. I think that change is not just simply a matter of rhetorical emphasis. I think that it is a real change and a real turn towards pessimism that both sort of explains part of the rise of Donald Trump and has been, in the interactions that you always see between politicians and voters, encouraged by Trump and Trumpism as a political phenomenon. To some extent, any successful politician takes things that his or her voters already felt at some level and makes them sort of more visceral and apparent. Things that you felt subconsciously suddenly become your voting intentions under the operations of a transformative politician. I think it's fair to call Trump transformative to some extent, whatever awaits in our future. So let's talk a bit about the nature of that transformation. And one way of understanding it, I think, is to consider American conservatism as conservatives themselves might think about it. Going back to the origins of what we think of as modern American conservatism in the aftermath of World War II, the 1950s and 1960s, and then sort of in a sort of expansion of conservatism in the 1970s with the rise of neoconservatism and the new right and the forces that led to Reagan's election in the first place. What did modern American conservatives imagine themselves to be doing? What did they imagine themselves to be defending, championing? What was the sort of point, the jumping off point for their movement? And I think one reasonable answer is to say that modern American conservatism sees itself as primarily a defense of American exceptionalism in all of its different forms. And by American exceptionalism, I don't just mean a sort of chest-thumping, we're the greatest country in the world, we rule, everybody else drools, although that does obviously play some role in conservative political rhetoric. But it's more complicated than just that sort of simple patriotic pride. It's also a sort of specific commitment to a bunch of the things that have historically distinguished the United States from other developed countries, from Western Europe especially, but at a certain point, the larger developed world. And I want to sketch out a few ways of thinking about those distinctives, right? What is it that makes America as a rich and powerful country in the 20th century different from peer countries, especially in Western Europe? So one thing is that we have a more overtly capitalist and commercial culture. America as a culture has always valorized the businessman, the entrepreneur, sometimes the confidence man on the make, even to an extent, But this has always been sort of woven into our national life to a greater extent than has been the case in the societies of Western Europe. Not that capitalism doesn't exist all across the Western world, not that it doesn't originate in Italy here and the Netherlands there and so on. But American culture has always been distinguished, I think, as a sort of particularly commercial and proud of it kind of society. And connected to that, we've always been, again, relative to our peers, a society distinguished by a strong suspicion of centralized power, a strong suspicion of a strong centralized state. And this is connected to that sort of commercial capitalist culture. It's connected, I think, in certain respects to the importance of dissenting Protestantism in American life, which is sort of a movement which, for understandable reasons, going back to the Reformation, tends to be pretty skeptical of centralized state power. So an important thread woven right through conservative politics in America is a kind of Scots-Irish, Southern Baptist hostility to centralized authority that goes back hundreds and hundreds of years to a world before America even fully existed. So you have sort of commercial capitalism, you have a skepticism of centralized authority, and you have a kind of intensely communitarian and voluntaristic culture. This is something that Alexis de Tocqueville famously observes on his journeys to America and the books he wrote about early America. He talks about America as a nation of joiners, where we effectively compensate for the relative weakness of our central government compared to Western Europe by setting up Elks Lodges and joining the Masons and eventually joining the Knights of Columbus, and these sort of small solidaristic groups all around the country that in fact, if you look at the data when Tocqueville was writing, that stuff had actually barely gotten off the ground. And you can sort of trace you can start when Tocqueville is in the US and trace sort of membership in everything from Elks Lodges to bowling leagues, to any other association you care to name, and it just goes up and up and up all the way to the middle of the 20th century. America starts as a nation of joiners and only becomes more so over time. And then connected to that, the United States is a more religious nation, pretty much from the start, than countries in Western Europe. And this is seen as sort of, in a way, a paradox because we don't have an established church, or maybe it's a vindication of our lack of an established church, that religions and churches are in competition with one another. But either way, not just in the 20th century, but going all the way back into the 19th century, back to the early republic, more Americans go to church, more Americans are members of churches, and that line too, I guess I could use the whiteboard, but that line too follows the same pattern as membership in secular volunteer organizations, going up and up and up, all the way down to the middle of the 20th century. So we're a commercial society, a small state society, a voluntaristic society, a religious society, and then we're a society that, and this we do have a little bit more in common with some of the old empires of Western Europe, but we see ourselves as having a particular mission in the world. And this view of American mission takes different forms. Sometimes we're the city on the hill, just sort of setting an example for the world. Sometimes we're sort of going abroad to make the world safe for democracy. But there's this clear sense from early on that manifests itself in different ways that America is, in Lincoln's phrase, we're an almost chosen people, right? We have some kind of specific, maybe divinely ordained role to play in the world that, and then this view sort of strengthens in many ways, especially with the American role in World War II and the defeat of Nazi Germany. And then you segue to the Cold War, where we're literally pitted against an avowedly atheistic, communist, strong state, a great power that's sort of the opposite in certain ways, or trying to be the opposite of all these distinctives that I've just listed. And that's American exceptionalism, you could say. And obviously I'm giving a positive view of it, and you could come in and offer critiques at each step. You could talk about the dark sides of commercial capitalism. You could say, the suspicion of centralized power enables local and state-based tyrannies like Jim Crow to flourish. So I'm not arguing that this is all an unalloyed good, but I'm saying conservatism sets itself up as a movement in service to those distinctives against forces, social forces and political forces that regard those distinctives as, either things that aren't important or as problems to be solved and done away with. So conservatism organizes itself against what it sees as centralizing, anti-capitalist, anti-communitarian, replacing the community with the state, what it sees as the anti-American exceptionalism of the left, and the early conservatives would say the center left as well. So that's sort of a way of thinking about the conservative origin point. And if you think about it this way, it helps make sense of what otherwise seem like some curious tensions within American conservatism from the beginning, right? For instance, American conservatism somehow contains within itself either overtly atheistic or at least extremely secular libertarians who are mostly interested in the capitalism part, and also some of the most religious groups in America, ranging from conservative Protestants to Catholics loyal to the pre-Vatican II Church. The sort of extremes of this, right, are sort of religious conservatism on the one hand, and Ayn Rand on the other hand. Whether Ayn Rand technically defines herself as a conservative is somewhat irrelevant. Her perspective is woven into this larger conservative coalition from the start, as is the perspective of people who look at Ayn Rand and see, a terrifying atheist whose views are anathema. And so those kind of tensions, though, can be explained by the fact that all of these groups, libertarians and social conservatives and foreign policy hawks and so on, find a point of alliance in their shared commitment to American exceptionalism, or maybe commitment is even the wrong word, in their shared embodiment of American exceptionalism, right? So even though they don't technically agree about the deepest purposes of human life, the nature of the universe, and so on, they are all embodiments of American distinctives, and they sort of naturally flock together in a world where they perceive that in some way American liberalism threatens those distinctives. So that's sort of a story about American conservatism's origin and purpose. And I think you can see the trajectory of American conservatism from the Reagan era to the Trump era as a trajectory from a period when most conservatives looked around and saw those American exceptionalisms as threatened but resilient, to an era when American conservatives looked around and wondered if those exceptionalisms even existed anymore, right? So the default of, let's say the sort of the libertarian commercial capitalist perspective in the late 1970s or early 1980s was that American economic policy had gone astray, that government had grown too large, that American society was taxed too much. But these were temporary problems, and if you remove those burdens, if you shrank the state and cut the top tax rate, and issued enough deregulatory measures, that American capitalism would sort of return roaring as strong as ever. And whether correctly or not, the economic growth under Ronald Reagan was perceived as vindicating that theory. It was like, well, we had stagnation and inflation in the late 1970s, but all we needed to do was get a conservative in the White House, cut taxes, and we could restore American economic vigor to something like its natural state. Or somewhat similarly, religious conservatives in that era could look at the United States and see a country that had gone through a major social revolution, in the 60s and 70s that had become much more socially liberal, that had become substantially more secular, but they could also say secularization, real secularization, is mostly an elite phenomenon. The sociologist Peter Berger around that time had a line that America, so think of India as one of the most religious countries in the world and Sweden as one of the least religious. The United States is a nation of Indians governed by an elite of Swedes, right? And this was sort of, that joke was sort of a reassuring idea for religious conservatives. It was like, all right, you have these bad Supreme Court justices who got rid of prayer in schools, and if you're pro-life, they issued Roe v. Wade. And, there's been sort of a secular elite, which was a very common phrase back then, a sort of secular elite conspiracy against religious and Christian America. But again, if you elected the right leaders, appointed the right Supreme Court justices, you could sort of undo that revolution, and fundamentally, America was still a deeply religious nation underneath. That fundamental reality hadn't changed. Or a final example, foreign policy, right? Republican cold warriors, Republican foreign policy hawks, who believed not just in America's Cold War grand strategy, but in America's general mission as sort of a defender of the free world writ large, looked at the Vietnam War, gains by the Soviet Union in the late 1970s, sort of a falling off of American power from its post-World War II heights, and said, well, the problem is, the Lyndon Johnson botched the Vietnam War, and then Jimmy Carter. I mean, don't get us started on Jimmy Carter, right? He's a political weakling. He let Iran take our people hostage and so on. We've basically had bad foreign policy leadership, and some of these hawks would include sort of Richard Nixon's realist foreign policy in their condemnations. It wasn't just as simple as sort of attacking Democrats, but there was, again, a narrative of elite fecklessness, bad mistakes in Vietnam, but maybe the war could have been won. But what we need is a restoration of American strength and moral clarity in the fight against communism, and then America will reclaim its rightful role as the Nazi defeating free world safeguarding power that it's meant to be. And 10 years after Ronald Reagan is elected, the Soviet Union shuts its doors. America declares victory in the Cold War, and we enter what was described, however briefly, as a unipolar moment, when America is the preeminent superpower, seemingly with a free hand to do whatever it wishes. And so there too, conservatives, Reagan-era conservatives, found in the developments of the time a kind of vindication of their view that America had problems, but the exceptionalism they wanted to defend was still there to be defended. So that's one way of thinking about the Reagan era. And I sort of glossed over how religious and social conservatives saw things because they were a little more pessimistic. Ronald Reagan did not succeed in overturning Roe v. Wade. The Supreme Court justices he appointed, some of them disappointed. There was a period around that time of pretty deep social conservative pessimism about American life in the early 1990s. But even there, by the late 1990s, there seemed to have been sort of positive turns. There had been sort of a little bump up in church going. Evangelical Christianity had grown substantially in ways that offset the decline of other forms of Protestantism. John Paul II was still sort of at the height of his powers as a popular Cold War winning pope. And starting in the 1990s, some of the sort of direst social trends in American life, the crime rate above all, but for social conservatives, the abortion rate, the teen pregnancy rate, even the divorce rate sort of went into reverse from a conservative perspective, started to improve. So even social conservatives, while they were less vindicated than the other factions by the Reagan era, could say, okay, we elected conservative politicians, we fought the secular elites, and things have started to change to some extent for the better. So this narrative then places us, let's say, somewhere in the late 1990s, around the time that George W. Bush starts running for the presidency of the United States. So then jump forward 20 years to the point at which Donald Trump begins running for president of the United States. And think about what changes in the United States from a conservative perspective, from this sort of exceptionalist perspective, from that point, the late 1990s to the mid 2010s. You can start, we'll go in reverse order, start with foreign policy, right? So George W. Bush comes into office, initially frames himself as, someone who has a humble foreign policy, a little more of a foreign policy realist and less of an idealist. But then 9/11 happens, it transforms his presidency, and he sort of deliberately adopts this kind of neo-Reaganite mantle. Except unlike Reagan, who was primarily a spending and rhetorical hawk, not an overt hawk, Bush, in a world where America doesn't face any serious great power rival, decides to use the American military for purposes of transformation and ultimately attempted democracy promotion and so on. And some of this is some of the democracy promotion rhetoric sort of takes on a new importance once we don't find weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. It's never as simple as Bush has an idealistic vision of the world and just enacts it. It's more complicated than that. Donald Rumsfeld was nobody's idea of an idealist. But with that said, in the rhetoric of the presidency, if you go back and read George W. Bush's 2004 inaugural address after he wins re-election, it is Reaganism plus. America is God's instrument for spreading democracy around the world, and nothing can stand in our way. So it's sort of peak American, sort of mission-based, hawkish conservatism. And then it all goes really badly. Iraq goes badly quickly, and we sort of stabilize things to some extent at the end of the Bush presidency, but then we pull out under Obama, and the Islamic State comes in, and it's perceived as just being sort of an open sore for years and years and years. Afghanistan, which from a liberal perspective for a while is seen as the good and necessary war, goes badly more slowly, but it goes badly as well. It becomes a much lower casualty for Americans version of the Vietnam War, a war that just sort of continues without anyone finding an endpoint. And those wars sort of, they fail to democratize the world. Instead, democracy begins to go into a kind of retreat around the world. Foreign powers that had briefly seemed like, if not our allies, at least potentially our friends, sort of return to their traditional postures as sort of rival centers of power. And connected to this, the sort of economic component of conservative foreign policy, which I've talked about. I mentioned protectionism earlier, but the side of conservative foreign policy that says just as our military spreads democracy, so does American capitalism spread liberty in its own way, right? We bring free market economics around the world, and as countries grow richer and become economically freer, they inevitably become freer in other ways as well. That narrative also hits the rocks in this period. If you go back to the sort of bipartisan opening to China, and in between the Bill Clinton and George W. Bush administrations, there's this incredible confidence that nothing can go wrong if we enter into a partnership with China to make both of us richer. And instead, China gets richer, but becomes eventually it becomes less authoritarian, and then it becomes more authoritarian. And meanwhile, the economic costs of free trade get concentrated in working class American communities. There are benefits to free trade as well, but the costs are more concentrated than economists expect, more destructive in certain ways. And so you have sort of double domestic blowback. You have, people coming home, soldiers coming home from Iraq with PTSD, soldiers who don't come home from Iraq, and you have free trade sort of blowing back on American industry, American factories, working class America, especially in the Midwest and the Rust Belt, right? So that's sort of one big story of those 15 or 20 years. The idea of free markets and democracy promotion as sort of globalization with the U.S. Marine Corps to back it up, come to real grief over those periods. Then at the same time, what happens to social trends over that period? Well, in certain ways, there's sort of continued improvement. The indicators that improved in the 1990s continue to improve. Crime continues to go down. The divorce rate continues to drop a little bit for a little while longer. So there's some continued stabilization. But from the point of view of religious conservatives, especially starting in the mid-2000s, around the same time that Iraq is falling apart, American culture turns against them in a big way. And the proximate issue is same-sex marriage, where the country swings to the left really, really rapidly, but it's bound up in a larger social liberalization and secularization. There's a kind of aftershock of the secularization of the 1960s, where you suddenly get the rise of the so-called nones, people with no religious affiliation, who are suddenly a huge proportion of the millennial generation and Generation Z. And as this happens, institutional Christianity is rocked by scandals, starting with the sex abuse crisis in the Catholic Church, that sort of undermines a lot of the narrative about Pope John Paul II, and then following with scandals and decline in evangelical Christianity as well. So you have that kind of rapid secularization and social liberalization. And then at the same time, and this is sort of happening a little bit underground in a way that sort of policymakers don't really notice for a while, but you have the rise of real sort of dislocation and despair in American life. You have the opioid epidemic above all, but the suicide rate starts to go up. And this, sort of starts in working class white America in the early 2010s. Eventually, it sort of expands, and once we get to the COVID era, and I'm getting ahead of ourselves, it sort of accelerates in various ways. But you have this kind of new sense of unhappiness, social disintegration, religious institutions in decline, and American communitarianism writ large goes into decline. All of those institutions, not just the religious institutions, the secular institutions, the bowling leagues, and the Elks Clubs and so on, they were already somewhat in decline in the late 1990s, especially when the internet comes along. They sort of drop off a cliff. And for a while, there's sort of this sort of semi-optimistic view that, well, people aren't joining clubs in the real world anymore, but look how many friends they have on Facebook. And then that turns out to be overly optimistic. And it seems like basically Americans have just lost a lot of social capital in the transition from a sort of bricks and mortar, flesh and blood social life to an online social life. So if you're really any kind of cultural conservative, but especially a religious conservative, you look at that period and you lose the sense that actually America, apart from the elites, is fundamentally still a sort of Christian, Tocquevillian, communitarian, church-going society. Instead, church-going, still a lot of American churchgoers, a lot more than in Western Europe, but it's much more of sort of, it's much more sort of a regional phenomenon, a phenomenon confined to the Republican Party, phenomenon, confined more to older Americans than younger Americans. It just doesn't make sense really to say, oh, America is fundamentally a Christian nation that just happens to have a secular Supreme Court. That narrative doesn't seem like it will hold. And then finally, and this connects back to the point about trade and transformation, but generally, America, after the dot-com bubble bursts, enters a period of slower than hoped for growth, demographic decline. After the Great Recession hits, there's a really slow economic recovery. American birth rates, which again were also sort of part of this distinctiveness. America always had higher birth rates than Western Europe. American conservatives could always point to that and say, look, we're a more dynamic, future-oriented society. That stops being the case. The American fertility rate starts falling in 2008 and keeps falling all the way through the next 10 or 12 years. And and then over this period, it suddenly becomes clear to a lot of people that America has only really had one form of real economic innovation and technological innovation in the last 50 years, and that's Silicon Valley and sort of digital entrepreneurship. And that's a real phenomenon. It's enough to like give the American economy a real boost in the late 90s when the internet comes online. But it's not the kind of growth that we took for granted from like the late 19th century through the middle of the 20th century. It's not growth and dynamism in all kinds of sectors. It's concentrated in this one area that also tends to be very virtually oriented, that maybe has, these sort of isolating and negative social effects. And there's this feeling that you've basically created an economy where it takes forever to build anything, where people are starting many fewer businesses than they used to. The business churn rate in American life goes way down from 1980 into the 2010s. And you have these new, and Silicon Valley is, supposed to create this sort of democratic landscape, but suddenly from the late 2000s on, it's a monopoly. It's a landscape of monopolies, these few small companies sort of dominating this landscape, not even employing that many people. They're not like, Ford and GM with huge workforces. They have small elite workforces. So people who go to, Penn and Harvard and Stanford and these kind of places, they're still doing fine. But the people who would have worked for a GM or a Ford are not getting hired to work at Google and Facebook and so on. And so you get out of that just a bleaker sense of the American economy, right? Because in this period, remember, first George W. Bush is president, he cuts taxes, bigger tax cuts than arguably than in the Reagan era. You have sort of a reapplication of that old conservative economic wisdom, and it generates a little bit of growth, but not like the Reagan or Clinton booms. And then you get the financial crisis. Then you get this long period in the Obama era of a really disappointingly slow recovery. And so you get to this point, and the point when Trump comes on the scene, where officially American conservatism is still committed to the Reagan vision. The Republican Party nominates Mitt Romney in 2012. Mitt Romney is a Mormon, the most pious and communitarian American faith. He is a businessman. He, the sort of paradigmatic example of American capitalism. He is a family man with a big family, and by God, he's a patriot. And he attacks Obama for being too weak on foreign policy. He's a foreign policy hawk. He never really has a bad word to say about George W. Bush's foreign policy. So you look at the American right in 2012 and you say, okay, this is still Ronald Reagan's party. Mitt Romney is, he's an American exceptionalist to the core. And he really is. That's who Romney is. Romney is he's the embodiment of the kind of conservatism that I've been talking about. But Romney is not actually where, at some level, the psyche of American conservatism is. And he wins that nomination because he's facing a divided field that keeps sort of generating candidates who say sort of unexpected, sometimes pessimistic things. It's Rick Santorum over here and Newt Gingrich over there, and sort of stirrings of Trump-like populism, brief celebrity candidates. There's sort of all these anticipations of the Trump era in 2012 that, people in my profession who are accustomed to stability don't necessarily see, because at the end of the day, Romney wins, and wasn't he always going to win? Then he loses narrowly to Obama, which confirms that, liberalism in power is here to stay. And he picks Paul Ryan, who's like a Reagan baby, right? A child of the Reagan era, someone who models his whole career on a certain vision of what Reaganism is as his running mate. Ryan is clearly the future of the party. And to the extent that there's anything the party needs to do, which is sort of an elite expectation after 2012, it's to get back to Reagan's optimism about immigration. It's like, all right, the party's become a little too hostile to immigrants, pessimistic about demographic change, but all we need to do is support comprehensive immigration reform. We'll win more Hispanic votes, and that will be fixed. And that's basically the only problem. This is the elite conservative view after Romney's defeat in 2012. And then Trump comes along. And it turns out that that's not where a lot of conservative voters are. And Trump starts out sort of building his brand off celebrity and off catering to racialized paranoia about Barack Obama. That's where sort of he gets his start. That's where he gets his first 15 to 20% of the Republican vote. But then what he builds on that is this, from the point of view of what I've just sketched out, this radically heterodox, unconservative message. He goes out on stage and says the Iraq War was a terrible mistake. He claims that he was against it. He wasn't against it, but that doesn't matter. He's against it now, and he's willing to say it was a mistake, and no one else is. And everyone says, oh, Trump's attacking the Iraq War. He's saying George W. Bush didn't keep us safe. Jeb Bush couldn't believe that anyone would say this about his brother. And it was like, Trump's campaign is finished. No, Trump's campaign wasn't finished because lots of Republicans thought the Iraq War was a mistake. They just didn't want to say it. Trump goes on stage and says, you know, our economic policy has been terrible. China's been eating our lunch. This is something Trump has been saying since the 1980s, but now it seems true, right? It seems true to a lot of people generally, certainly a lot of Republican voters. Trump gets on stage and says, you know, I don't like Obamacare, but we're going to take care of people. You know, we got to have a national health policy and so on because the economy hasn't been good. And Ted Cruz says, you're not a conservative. Trump says, I don't care, right? And he wins, and Ted Cruz loses. And foreign policy, Trump says, you know, he says America first, right? He channels 1930s isolationism. He channels Pat Buchanan in 1992. You know, it's not just the Iraq War was a mistake. It's all a mistake. All of America's commitments overseas, all of our entangling alliances. We have to make a deal with Russia. We have to make a deal with Russia and confront China. It's like pure brass-knuckled realpolitik with a side of a man crush on Vladimir Putin. And everyone's like, well, this will never fly with Republican voters. They hate Russia. Right? They like NATO. Do Republican voters like NATO? No, they like the idea of American power as a force for good in the world, but they've just lived through 20 years in which aggressive, ambitious, even utopian Republican foreign policy has come to grief over and over again, and lots of people have died, and billions or trillions of dollars have been wasted, and meanwhile, China seems to be gaining at our expense. And so they embrace Trump, and they vote for Trump. Not with total enthusiasm, but a big chunk of the party is enthusiastic about him. And that's enough to get him the nomination. Then, very unexpectedly, especially against people in my profession, he gets the presidency itself, and that's enough to seal him to Republican voters. He has succeeded where John McCain and Mitt Romney failed. He is their champion against this sense that it's evening in America and that American exceptionalism has come to an end. So that's a somewhat long-winded story that ends 6 years ago, unfortunately. And I don't want to bore you with sort of a really long dissection of the presidency and post-presidency that followed. Instead, I want to say two things, right? The first is that, as hopefully you can tell from this talk, what I'm sketching here is not paranoia. It's not, people just, looking at demographic change and not recognizing America anymore for, sort of purely racialized reasons and voting for Trump for that reason. That's there, certainly. Paranoia is there, certainly. There's plenty of paranoia on the American right. But the diagnosis that says certain things that we used to think we were conserving aren't there to conserve anymore, that diagnosis isn't crazy. That diagnosis accurately describes real changes in American life over the last 20 years. Some of these changes are things that both liberals and conservatives could agree are bad. Nobody is in favor of the opioid epidemic or the rise in suicide rates. Some of them are things that conservatives think are bad and liberals don't, or maybe don't, like trends in secularization, social liberalism, and so on. But either way, they're all real things, real changes in American life. And the question that Trump sort of addressed himself to, right, is a really hard one for conservatism to answer, which is, what do you do when the things you're conserving don't seem to be there anymore? What do you do when conservatism doesn't have an object for its self-described purpose? Or, let's be honest, does have an object, but not nearly as strong an object as it did before, and not a sort of nation-defining object, right? In the way that you could see sort of these aspects of American identity as central to America in the past. And there are various answers, and you've seen, I think, conservatives play with all of them over the last 6 to 8 years. One answer is to just say, well, America is a different country. It doesn't embody many of the things that I thought were worth fighting for, but it still embodies a lot of good things. And I'm not interested in reaction, which is sort of the more extreme alternative to conservatism, right? Is reaction. I'm not interested in that. And that, if you take that perspective, you will drift away from the Republican Party and conservatism as it currently exists. Maybe you won't become a liberal, maybe you'll just vote against Donald Trump, but you will feel reasonably comfortable with the idea that, okay, the world changed, I don't love it, but I'll make my peace with the new reality, rather than trying to sort of figure out how to overthrow it. So that's one model, and you can see in certain parts of Never Trump conservatism that model sort of taking effect. Another model is the model of the people I'm sort of friendly with and argue with and sort of go to conferences with sometimes and so on. The people who are sort of policy people, the intellectuals, right, who look at Trump and say, okay, we don't like him, we don't love him, we're not necessarily for him, but you got to admit that the people who voted for him are responding to these certain realities, and you need a policy response to these realities. If American conservatism hasn't succeeded in conserving an industrial base or economic growth or religion and family and social stability or a successful foreign policy, then you need to think anew, and you need a new policy agenda. And maybe that policy agenda, like Trump himself, won't follow Reagan-era conservative orthodoxies. You won't just cut taxes. You'll try and have industrial policy. You'll necessarily take a more sort of hard-headed view of world relations and, cut deals with unsavory characters in order to sort of shore up America's weakened standing in the world. You'll be more aggressive on culture war issues. You'll say, we lost the culture war because, we let social liberals run the table on us, and we need to fight back, right? So it's a mix of sort of policy and strategy that tries to basically rebuild the things that conservatives were defending and feel like have slipped away, right? And that's sort of the vision of anyone who says they want Trumpism after Trump, which a lot of people say they want, including me on occasion. Will say something like that. They'll say, whether or not it's completely possible, if you think these were good things about America, you think they've been lost, you have an obligation to try and rebuild them. And the only place to start is with the shift that Trump made in the Republican Party. So you have to start there. So that's another response. The third response is it's not the wonks response or the intellectual response. It's the more popular and, in the true sense, populist response, which is to lean into paranoia and the apocalyptic and so on, and to invest deeply in Trump himself as a kind of savior figure, to build narratives where these sort of policy challenges can be reduced to simple good versus evil battles, right? So it's like, well, why has America become so much more socially and culturally liberal and so much less Christian? There is an elite cabal, maybe of pedophiles, maybe just friends of Jeffrey Epstein, who are in some sense responsible for this, and Trump is fighting them, right? That's the sort of extreme QAnon version, But there are sort of graduated steps in between, which aren't as sort of richly paranoid, but which take the view that, you know, these are not just organic trends, these are trends that liberalism has brought to America. They're bad enough that you need to fight liberalism tooth and nail. And from there, you get to both sort of the specifics of the 6th of January and also the general sort of, you know, fighting mentality that, you know, informed the entire Trump presidency and informs big parts of the Republican Party today. The sense of like, well, we're sort of, we've lost so much, we're this close to the final defeat. Therefore, to quote Teddy Roosevelt, we have to stand at Armageddon and battle for the Lord, right? That is a really powerful sentiment in conservative politics. And I think those are sort of, that tripartite division is a decent way of thinking about it, though it excludes, of course, the many, many Republican voters who, you know, don't feel that way and are just voting Republican because they don't like something about liberals and Democrats, which is still a much, you know, there's still plenty of normalcy in Republican politics, notwithstanding the somewhat apocalyptic narrative I've spun. But I want to end by suggesting, you know, that sort of there are ways in which the apocalyptic style, I think people assume that the apocalyptic style either leads to some crisis point where there's a coup and America becomes a right-wing authoritarian state, or where the right does something so terrifying that everyone agrees that this can never happen again and Trump is banished forever and so on. And I think both of those scenarios are quite unlikely. I think what might be more plausible is that you sort of I mean, Trump is really a distinctive sui generis figure, unlike even the various populists of Europe. But I think if you look at European populism, what you often see are people sort of less sort of wild and narcissistic and, you know, sort of frankly sometimes ridiculous. They aren't like that aspect of Trump, but what you get instead is this sort of sense of like, well, you know, we're going to sort of maintain a kind of apocalyptic style to describe the situation of Europe and the United States to our voters. At the same time, we don't actually have any solutions to the problems we're describing. And so we sort of sustain this combination of, you know, apocalyptic rhetoric to reassure people who see all the trends that I'm describing that something is being done about it, without anything that actually being done about it. And rather than leading inexorably to crisis, I kind of think that style of conservative politics could last for a while, not eternally or indefinitely. But if you said, what is the most likely future of American conservatism after Trump, I might say, you know, it's politicians who adopt some key aspects of Trumpy rhetoric, a few pieces of populist policy, don't ever try and come up with some grand plan to, you know, restore American exceptionalism, and are sort of comfortable, though they wouldn't admit this, managing American decline while chest thumping all the time about how they're restoring American greatness. And that I think is a quite plausible vision of the next generation of conservative leadership. A lot of promises to make America great again, fewer attempts to get Mike Pence to, you know, keep you in office after you've lost, but also not actual responses to, again, the very real transformations in American life that have very understandably made American conservatives more pessimistic than they would have been in Ronald Reagan's presidency. So I'll end there. Thank you all so much for listening. And for at least 30 minutes, we can have a conversation. And how should we, are you?
It's coming from 501 to run the other mic.
Oh, okay.
So we can take one each side of the room.
Okay, so we'll start, sir.
First of all, I really wanted to say thank you for coming. I've read a number of your books and really enjoyed reading your takes. One of the few reasons to read the New York Times.
Yeah, that's not true. But thank you, but that's not true.
One of my questions is about the post-Dobbs, post-Roe landscape we find ourselves in. It seems as if the social conservative wing of the Republican Party was preparing for so many years for this to happen, was fighting so hard for this to happen. And yet, the minute it happened, it seemed like they completely lost their ability to defend the policies they had stood for so long. I mean, even Lindsey Graham, who never was very socially conservative, is proposing a very mild abortion proposal, and like the party can't even stand behind that. So what would explain why the social conservatives suddenly completely lost their song when Roe went away, despite all this hard work that they put in? Have they drank too much from the individualistic well of liberalism?
Yes, of course. Deep drafts. No, I mean, I think so there's a few things going on, but one is that, so if you're talking about the level of Republican politicians have not pushed for decades and decades to overturn Roe v. Wade. Pro-life activists have pushed for decades and decades, and in return for their votes, Republican politicians have promised to appoint Supreme Court justices who most Republican politicians have hoped would ultimately do what John Roberts wanted to do and sort of chip away at Roe, but use judicial power to move America towards a slightly more conservative, you could argue more European abortion regime without ever going all the way. I mean, I don't want to, there are plenty of sincerely pro-life Republican politicians. I cast no aspersions on their sincerity, but the average Republican politician was not enthusiastic about overturning Roe. And the rule of abortion politics in American life, in my lifetime, has been that Americans don't want to debate abortion and don't like political parties that ask them to debate abortion or feel uncomfortable about abortion. And sometimes, when it's a Republican Senate candidate in the past, talking about women who've been raped, it's the Republicans who get punished. Sometimes if it's the Democrats, opposing partial birth abortion, it's the Democrats who get punished. But generally, that's been the pattern. And so the Republican politician expectation after Roe is that if you overturn Roe, you're going to get punished by the voters. Even if those voters, including some voters who in some surveys might call themselves pro-life, right? American public opinion polling on abortion is famously sensitive to how you ask the question. But the reasonable way of thinking about it is that there's about 30% of Americans who are pro-life under a reasonable definition, where it's like they want abortion banned in most cases, and there's between 20 and 30% of America that is persuadable but will swing pro-choice if pro-lifers appear to have too much power, and vice versa. And then there's 45% of America that's fundamentally pro-choice. That would be my take on the opinion. So if that's the dynamic, then Republicans 100% expected the end of Roe to hurt them politically. And what you've seen from them is to the extent that they had a political strategy that they had prepared, it is the political strategy. It is, say this is a state matter, don't try and nationalize it, even with something that is technically like a 15-week ban with certain exceptions, polls reasonably well, but you still don't want to do it because then you're talking about abortion as a national political issue. You don't want to do that. I'm describing their mentality. I'm not saying this is the only way to think about it, but if you want to understand the psychology of the party, that's the psychology. Then the pro-life movement is sort of betwixt and between. The pro-life movement is, on the one hand, in certain forms, very politically realistic. It always has been. I mean, you don't spend 50 years fighting a battle that seems lost repeatedly and ultimately win it if you aren't politically realistic to some extent, right? So the pro-life movement is something liberals who are frustrated with activists on the left will sometimes say, look at the pro-life movement, they know not to glue themselves to the rotunda of the Capitol in order to get Mitch McConnell to pass an abortion ban because they know that would be unpopular, right? Whereas our activists are, what their activists are, right? So, but at the same time, the pro-life movement also, they supported Graham. They want, especially at a moment right now, we'll see how it looks in a week, where it seems like Republicans are going to win. They want to claim part of that win, right? They want to say, oh, look, Republicans campaigned on these abortion regulations and won, so therefore they're popular. So the pro-life movement has sort of moved back and forth between those two. It's realism on the one hand, but also its desire to not just have Republican politicians not talk about it. But I mean, fundamentally, like the challenge for the pro-life movement right now is not winning a battle over a 15-week abortion ban. It is that there are some states that have banned abortion. There are some states that have heavily restricted it. And the question is, can those restrictions be sustained without generating public backlash, without generating horrible cases of women in terrible situations, of which there have been some, right? And, right now, Texas, has incredibly strict abortion laws. Texas is a really big and diverse state. Is that sustainable? That's the ball game for the pro-life movement, I would say. But if in 5 or 10 years, the states that right now have abortion restrictions on the books still have them on the books, and there hasn't been a major public backlash, that's what plausible success over this moment with this public opinion dynamic looks like for the pro-life movement, proving that you can be a humane, modern, egalitarian society and have big states banning abortion and people accept it. I don't think there's any bigger victory that the pro-life movement could possibly win, honestly. And again, that includes some kind of national abortion ban at 20 weeks. There are plenty of abortions after 20 weeks, but there's, as the pro-choice side likes to say, relative to the number of early abortions, there aren't that many. So it's like, the heartbeat law in Georgia is just a much bigger deal politically. It's defense from a pro-life perspective than Lindsey Graham's bill. So in a way, that's sort of a partial defense of the Republican strategy. Anyway, I've gone on too long, but thanks. Sir.
I just wanted to ask about, from your point of view, the evolution of thinking where, I guess from my perspective, at the time of the Reagan administration and the very large tax cuts and deficit spending that occurred, at that time, I'm thinking more was a function of trying to overcome the stagnation of the economic period that preceded it.
Yep.
To today, where no one seems to care at all about very large deficits in either party. There are a few exceptions, but they seem to be very few. And could you comment on that in terms of the evolution of conservative thinking? If I'm correct, that there was a fiscal conservatism built into the Republican ethos, an American exceptionality as you described it, financial temperance.
Yep.
It just doesn't seem to matter anymore how the books are balanced at the federal level.
Right. Well, it may matter more now than it has at any point in my adult lifetime. I mean, but because of inflation, right? I mean, I think what happened in the Reagan era was that Reagan tried to combine what you're describing, that sort of traditional thrift-oriented small government form of American conservatism, with a desire to break the loop of stagnation, get the economy moving again, and so on. And so within his administration, he had both traditional deficit hawks and supply-siders who said, well, we don't need to worry so much about the deficit if we can get the economy moving again. And one story is that the deficit hawks were vindicated because the supply-siders got their tax cuts, but it didn't generate enough growth to pay for the tax cuts, and so deficits went up. I think fundamentally the supply siders were vindicated in that the constraint on spending, the sign that your spending is out of control, is inflation. And after Paul Volcker broke the back of inflation with the early 1980s recession, inflation mostly vanished as an issue in American life until right now. Like, I grew up with no real memory of inflation as a substantial part of American politics. And all these older conservatives, when Obama was president, they were like, oh man, he's spending all this money, we're gonna get the 70s back, we're gonna get inflation back, and we didn't, right? And so there've been these repeated moments when, you know, people have expected spending to lead to inflation, it doesn't. And the compounding of all of those moments explains why true limited government politics has, you know, it's been for Republicans a way to critique whatever liberals want to do, but it hasn't been a force unto itself that leads to real spending cuts under Republican politicians. Instead, Republicans have basically, you know, followed the Reagan approach under Bush and again under Trump. This is one of those continuities I talked about at the start, where you say, okay, inflation isn't a constraint. We need growth. We're going to run deficits in order to get more growth. And it's only now, after this sort of hit an absolute peak with, I mean, this mentality was taken to the nth degree, to its logical extreme in the COVID era. It's only now that finally we've hit whatever the limit is. But hitting that limit is bad, because obviously it's bad. But, you know, one of the problem in the American economy, right, is that it's, you know, I talked a bit about stagnation. And when you talk about stagnation in the American economy, people will say, okay, but, you know, it's even so, GDP still basically goes up like this, you know, from Reagan all the way to the Trump era. And that's true, but the other thing that goes up are deficits, right? So we have been, in effect, compensating for our inability to generate innovation and dynamism, also to some extent our low birth rates, by running bigger and bigger deficits. And that, it's not crazy policy, right? Like, it's better to have growth than not to have growth. But if we're finally hitting the limit on that, where the politics of deficits don't matter is going away, then we've got a problem, because that recipe for growth, as limited as it was a recipe for growth, and we don't have a clear recipe to replace it right now. And this is, you know, you've seen what you just saw in the United Kingdom with Liz Truss's attempt to imitate Reagan. Now, I had a fun discussion over dinner with some of our British cousins about, you know, what the actual piece of the Truss budget was that caused the meltdown and destroyed her prime ministership. But the general sense was like, Truss tried to do the deficits don't matter thing into the teeth of inflation and got whipped. And if that's the case, then where's the UK going to get growth, right? You know, it's not going to, it's the same, the constraint applies to left-wing programs and populist programs and so on. So it's a potentially a deepening of the dynamic that I'm describing in this talk, that we're finally returning to a politics of limits after floating ourselves on deficit spending for so long. Way in the back, sir, in the yellow cap.
Thank you very much. I wanted to ask a question about how you see Trump as a potential figure of realignment in the politics. I know this is kind of maybe debated, but your colleague David Brooks just had an article in the New York Times maybe a month or two ago where he said maybe provocatively something like the Republican Party is starting to look like a multiracial working party. And I bring that up because when Trump ran, he was running during a period in which the Republican Party was the kind of coalition since the Reagan era was in, maybe crisis is too strong of a word, but it definitely didn't have the glue together that it had, let's say, in 2000 or even before that. And likewise, one could maybe make the case that Obama was holding on to a Democratic Party that itself was already kind of fracturing, right? That he kind of kicked the can down the road in a certain sense. And you described Trump earlier as heterodox, or that the policies around him were very heterodox. And it raises a thought to me, just looking at American political history. Okay, the Republican Party was opposed to the New Deal at one time, and then Eisenhower comes in and he extends on certain parts of the New Deal. And likewise, we see the other side of it with Clinton kind of extending on sides of Reagan's reforms. And perhaps maybe Trump right now is part of just the general American political historical process that's realigning what it means to be a conservative and mean to be a liberal or whatever would be opposed to that. So I kind of wanted to, maybe you touched on this earlier, but maybe if you could talk about that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's a really good question. And right, because one of, the story that I've been telling has, emphasized ideas a bit more, ideas of what a conservative is, a bit more than, let's say, class identity. But obviously, class identity matters intensely too. And for a long time, the Republican Party had a distinct class identity of being a middle to upper middle class party with a bunch of rich people, right? And beginning in sort of the 1970s, continuing through Reagan and so on, it built majorities by adding to that coalition working class voters, disaffected, mostly white working class voters, disaffected with either economic policies of the Democrats or cultural liberalism or both. But it was still down to George W. Bush. You would say fundamentally it's a upper middle class college educated party with a big working class constituency. And in the Trump era, that's flipped. It's now much more, we'll say it's a non-college educated party. Working class is it's endlessly contested what the exact meaning of that term is, because there are people who are non-college educated who make a lot of money, right? So are they working class? You could debate that back and forth. But it's clearly a situation where the core, the base of the Republican Party post-Trump is non-college educated. And this tracks this broad transformation in all of Western politics, where parties of the center left are losing working class supporters and gaining upper middle class supporters, and parties of the center right, the reverse. Boris Johnson's huge majorities in the UK before the Tories threw it all away were built on winning traditional labor voters to his coalition in the same way or similar way that Trump won Midwestern working class Obama voters. So there, then from that point you have, so that's a partial realignment at least. So then to that point you add two questions. One, and they're sort of connected, right? What would complete that realignment? Well, one thing, the two things that would complete it would be, on the one hand, policy success. If the Republican Party was perceived to have delivered for those voters, right? If you had, and you actually did have this to some extent, whatever Trump's responsibility was for it pre-COVID, there were some real wage gains for working class voters in his presidency that were larger than some wage gains in the Obama era, right? So there was a sort of narrative that actually this, the Trump economy is better for the working class than the Obama economy was, like a 17-day debate about why that was. But so if you could have policy success, so it wasn't like, oh, Republicans are winning the working class just because the working class hate the urban elites. They're winning for winning them and then delivering. But also in the American context, can you get from the white working class as your core to a multiracial coalition, right? And yeah, the interesting thing is that Donald Trump, the birther candidate, the most anti-immigration, Mexico's sending us rapist candidate, did slightly better than Mitt Romney in 2016 with Hispanics and African Americans, and did a lot better than Mitt Romney in 2020. And if you look at 2022 and how it's shaping up, the Republican Party is poised, according to some polls, to have its best showing since Reagan, maybe, with minority voters across the board. So in that sense, you could say that is happening. But again, the question is, that is durable to the extent that it's associated with effective policy. It's more unstable to the extent that it's, let's say, Hispanic voters who don't like woke progressivism voting for Republicans as like a cultural statement, or parents who are unhappy with progressive curricula in their schools voting Republican. Like those things can turn people into Republicans, but they don't have the same sort of consolidating effect as real economic success, right? The Reagan coalition lasted a long time because Reagan was seen not just as like a culture warrior who stuck it to the hippies, but as an economic success. And that would be the thing that would, take you beyond. And then there's also just the reality that realignment goes away if Republicans are just sort of like, back to sort of January 6th theatrics very, very quickly, right? That's sort of a separate but related point. Sure, yeah, microphone's there.
Do you feel politically lonely?
Well, I have 4 children. They all agree with me on everything. So no, not in the slightest. I don't know. I feel. I mean, one, there's sort of, as a conservative who writes for the New York Times, I obviously write for people who disagree with me a lot, and that can be taxing and tiring in certain ways. But it's also a great opportunity, right? It's what you want as a writer. You want to write for people who, in theory, you might, in some tiny way, persuade about something. So I try to look at it that way. The truth is that in terms of my relationship to national politics, in hindsight, I realize that the politician who most closely approximates my own politics was probably George W. Bush in 2000, when he ran as a moderate religious conservative, compassionate conservative who was sort of more economically interventionist than the Gingrich Congress, and a foreign policy realist, which, broadly speaking, sort of describes my perspective. And at the time, I was for McCain against him, right? And you don't know what you've got till it's gone. Since then, yeah, I became very disillusioned with the Bush administration in its period of failure. I was never, even though I'd supported him in 2000, I was never a big McCain guy in 2008, because that was the point at which I was like trying to write about conservative domestic policy all the time, and McCain didn't care about domestic policy. Romney, I really liked as a person and like more now in certain ways, but his 2012 campaign I thought was totally ill-suited, for reasons you can tell from this talk, to the world as it existed. And then Trump was like this bizarre fulfillment of things that I had described in a positive way, but I did not think that Trump was a positive development. So in that sense, I have just sort of grown used to being someone who is, I'm not a liberal. I can't, I did an event with Bill Kristol recently, who was my predecessor as a token conservative at the New York Times. And, Bill, I've known Bill a long time. I really like Bill. Bill has sort of, in his revulsion against Trump, has sort of become comfortable just sort of being on the liberal side. And I think part of that is Bill's core commitments were always about foreign policy and sort of America's role in the world. And those aren't my core commitments, are weirder and more eccentric than that, but also more conservative in the end. And so I can't sort of join the liberals, so I have to exist in some kind of relationship to conservatism. But I've sort of, I feel like I've already had the phase of my life where I was like part of a group of people who had an idea of what the Republicans should do. That was sort of the 2006 to 2015 phase of my life. And now I think of myself as a right-leaning journalist trying to accurately describe reality, which I undoubtedly fail at all the time, but that seems like vocation enough. And, I've got friends. Sure, they're just out of the frame, having a great time with me. But no, I do. I mean, one thing that is true, that is a real asset in my position, and it may not last forever, but I genuinely really like a lot of different people and writers. I don't like politicians. Politicians are really, some of them I'm sure are good people, as Donald Trump would say, but they really just disappoint you. They really do. So I don't like them. But writers, journalists, intellectuals, left, right, in between, I like them. I think there's a lot of interesting people writing things, and the world has gotten a lot worse in many ways since I was the age of some undergrads and grad students here. But it's become a more interesting place to write about, and there are a lot of interesting things being written about it. And there are a lot of people who are part of, people who absolutely hate each other, sort of various binaries in intellectual life, and I often like both of them to some small degree, at least, and that's helpful. That's pretty helpful, I think, for the kind of work that I do. I like plenty of people who might not even wish to be liked by me, but we're all God's children, except for the politicians. So, so we have 5 minutes. So let's try and do Sir at the back, and then we'll do a lightning round with two questions put together, maybe.
So my question mainly involves around like the narrative that is starting to really animate conservatives these days. And like one of the things that kind of struck me in recent news was, say, some of the populist rhetoric in some European countries. I think of Viktor Orban, Tucker Carlson making an overture to him in Hungary, and also to some of the rhetoric around Vladimir Putin. He gave a speech today where he in fact tries to emulate some of this "we're losing the West" kind of rhetoric again.
He's against cancel culture.
There you go. So I guess my question is I see that, and then I contrast it with some of the atrocities that at least Putin in the war against Ukraine is committing. And I just wonder, do you think that has, because I know I'm not sure, but I think there are some conservatives who kind of rally to that idea, but do you think that is something that's sustainable, or maybe just a blip that maybe will go away if we just turn down the polarization?
I mean, I think the part of the American right that was really legitimately friendly to Putin was always quite small. It did include maybe the former occupant of the White House, so that's not nothing. But there were a lot of American conservatives who were like, Putin's a tough guy who makes Obama look weak, or makes our leadership look weak. They were sort of using Putin as a kind of foil. And even the faction of the American right, first of all, the faction of the American right that's fully against American support for Ukraine is clearly a minority faction on the right. Kevin McCarthy came out the other day and said, well, if we win the House, we might look at cutting aid to Ukraine. He's pandering to a portion of his caucus, but there's a lot of people in the Republican House caucus who are very eager to keep voting for aid to Ukraine, and Republican senators are extremely eager to keep doing so. And if you look at public opinion polls, liberals and Democrats are somewhat more supportive of our support for Ukraine, but it's not some huge partisan split. And at the outset of the war, there was no partisan split at all. So the narrative that the people on the American right who are legitimately pro-Putin are basically the sort of Nietzscheans on Twitter, which is not, I'm not these are real, this is a real thing, right? That again, did not exist back in the day. I mean, I had friends in college who would, get drunk and talk a lot about what Nietzsche got right, and they were drunk. But the idea of this sort of there's a faction that is sort of sympathetic to some mix of fascism and anarchism and so on, and has certain writers who they read and so on. That's a novelty. That's a real thing. But in terms of it's that's not operating on actual Republican politics to a substantial degree, I would say. But what you had is, a kind of anti-Putinism on the right that sort of evaporated when Putin went to war with Ukraine, and has sort of returned as a kind of anti-war sentiment, but it's not full full Putinism. Orban is a different case. There are lots of American conservatives who like Orban. And what they like about Orban is basically that they have a theory of the trends I've just described that is very elite driven. It says we've had this consolidated liberal elite that's just gotten more and more progressive over time, and they sort of dominate the commanding heights of American culture, and they don't, even if conservatives wanted to restore what made America great, they couldn't because of this sort of concentration of a liberal elite power. And Orban is basically using his dominance of a small country's political life to try and create a kind of miniature conservative elite. Like a conservative, there's this term people have for the DC foreign policy establishment, the blob. Maybe some of you have heard that term. Orban is like building his own blob. It's like, we got a think tank over here, and we got a university over here, and you can come give talks and so on. All these things that intellectuals, conservative intellectuals, we would like to have universities. And I mean, this is not that this is not a wonderful university, but the idea of sort of creating from using political power, which conservatives have, to sort of create cultural power. That's what they like about Orban. But even there, most of the conservatives who like Orban will not say, I like him because he gerrymandered the opposition out of power. They will say, oh, this is overstated, Hungary is still a democracy, and so on, right? So it's not, we can argue about how authoritarian Orban is, but Orban's American fans primarily see him as like a tough guy president who is popular, is democratically elected, and is using power to win, using political power to win cultural battles. So there's a lot of the American right that is sort of basically there are a few figures on the American right who are basically say, like, I want a Caesar, I want a dictatorship, and these kind of things. That's not the dominant mode on the American right. The dominant mode on the American right, in its popular form, wants to say, we're the real Democrats, the people are on our side, the liberals just stole the last election, which is a dangerous and destabilizing sentiment, but is different from, we want to cancel the elections. Or at the elite level, a sense of like, we want to be democratically elected, we just want to use political power in this aggressive way that we think liberals have been doing all along. I think it's quite reasonable to look at those dynamics and be worried about where they can go, but they aren't the same as like saying, Putin's presidency for life is the model for what we want from Ron DeSantis, basically. All right, so let's do two more, and I'll wrap up. So, sir, right there, and sir in the Phillies cap back there.
So, if you are a sincere, thoughtful, caring human being who is truly of the conservative bent, are you bothered by a system in which the drift toward disproportionate wealth has become extreme? I mean, what do you say about a society in which the capitalism has led to such radical disparities in wealth? Does that strike you as, oh, that's great, let the ones who have very little just shake their butt and they'll do okay? I mean, because if you throw everything else that's rotten off the table and you just have that alone is a real problem. So what is a true conservative sensibility about that problem? And if there isn't one, what's your personal feeling about how that should be, if it should be addressed?
That's a great question. And sir, who's going to win Friday night?
Yeah, hopefully us. My brief question is if you have a recommended schema or litmus test for evaluating candidates, say like a Hawley or a Blake Masters, who you might think, wow, I like a lot of what they have to say, but they also say some odd or dangerous things about elections, et cetera.
They're both good questions. Okay, so the traditional conservative answer to your question was that what mattered was whether was not the fortunes at the top, but growth at the middle and at the bottom. And so if you have super large fortunes at the top, but incomes are growing at the middle, then that's okay. I'm describing the traditional conservative answer, not my own view necessarily. And so inequality is a problem to the extent that it goes hand in hand with stagnation. Now, to some extent, the latter has been true in the last 20 years. Now, it's a little more complicated than that in the late 1990s, you did have a period that was more like what conservatives traditionally would say they wanted. In the late 1990s, in the dot-com boom, you have a lot of big fortunes being made, but you also have real middle-class income growth. So that's sort of what conservatives say that they want. But thereafter, you have at least sort of stable inequality, lots of big fortunes, and a certain amount of economic stagnation. Out of that, what I think is the sort of the smartest take that is within the parameters of conservatism is to say the issue is not sort of some individuals and their fortunes. The issue is sort of structural inequality. So you should look at, the problem is not just Bill Gates getting rich or Donald Trump getting rich. It is that we've created an economy that makes certain sectors and regions super rich, the coasts, Silicon Valley above all, and hollows out other regions and other populations, and doesn't, what I said earlier about the idea of like Henry Ford is super rich, but he's employing tons of people in good middle and working class jobs. Mark Zuckerberg is super rich and he's employing a bunch of engineers and cleaning ladies and nothing in between. But where's the middle class, right? So out of that, you get this sort of conservative curiosity about, it doesn't necessarily go beyond curiosity for any politicians, but about industrial policy, about, the idea that the answer to this is not sort of just, the Elizabeth Warren, like institute a wealth tax and use that money to fund social programs. It's to figure out how you can revitalize American industries that restore the other balance, where yes, great fortunes are still being made, but they're being made in ways that employ more and more people. I think that's sort of where the most serious thinking about these issues on the right is. To the extent that I'd go further than that, I would say that in an environment of economic constraint, if you have ambitions to spend money on anything, you will need to find sources for that money. And in that sense, the conservatism that can never raise taxes on the rich is not going to be able to do some of the things that the populist. You're not going to be able to have an industrial policy under inflationary conditions, because you can't just print money to pay for it the way we've been doing. And at some point, the conservative identity as this potential multiracial working class party that the questioner was gesturing at is in a fundamental tension with Grover Norquist's tax pledge and never raising taxes on great fortunes. And that, is sort of another place where that sort of realignment can be sort of partially undone. If we're like in an atmosphere of constraint, people want some money spent, and Republicans say, we're the working class party, but we're never gonna tax a rich person. That creates a problem for Republicans. Yeah, I'll leave it there. And just so to your question, it's a good question, and I think this is where my point about detachment from politicians comes in, because yes, to some extent, Josh Hawley, Blake Masters, J.D. Vance, who I've known for a fairly long time, all embody, some version of like a working class friendly conservatism of the kind that I have theoretically been writing about for a long time. At the same time, the price of being a populist in today's Republican Party is some degree of fealty to Donald Trump. And fealty to Donald Trump means fealty to a sort of paranoid and destabilizing narrative about American elections. And that's a big problem. It's not a problem, I think, that you get away, like there isn't a moment where the problem goes away because a bunch of heroic Republican senators stand up and say, no more, Mr. President, right? Or no more, Mr. Trump, but they'd still have to call him Mr. President, right? Probably. Anyway, it is more likely that it goes away by Republican voters sort of tiring of Trump in some way, and his successors being less shameless and unembarrassed about making crazy, destabilizing choices, right?
Could you ever vote for an election to
I mean, voting. I'm a journalist. What do we mean by an election denier? I would not vote for Doug Mastriano, right? Would I vote for someone who said, there are a lot of people who had legitimate questions about the 2020 election because of the crazy way it was run, and I understand where they're coming from? I would consider voting for someone like that. And then you have territory in between, there's like fine gradations. But I would not vote for Trump. I wouldn't vote for someone who I thought would sincerely support anything like the plan that Trump cooked up. I mean, the reality is like a case like like the Republicans who made the choices they did in 2020 thought of themselves as part of this bipartisan tradition of Democrats objecting, not just in 2000 when it was understandable, but in 2004 and again in 2016. And there was sort of this sense of like, well, we are doing political theater, and this goes to my my general sort of low estimation of politicians. I have a low estimation of politicians, therefore in some ways that you could say that would make me reconcile myself to supporting someone who engaged in that kind of political theater. But I mean, January 6th was my official position is that January 6th was not as bad as many of my readers at the New York Times think it was, but it was really, really bad. That, and I'm generally, I would like, certainly my general view is I want Mastriano and Lake to lose. And the other cases, it's more sort of, it's more case by case. But I think Lake will probably win. So, All right. On that note, thank you all so much. I hope this was fun. I really appreciate it.